So today I'd like to introduce you some new line of work that I've been doing after completing my PhD dissertation about explicit and implicit learning and knowledge. And so, why do we care about explicit and implicit concepts? Okay, so, all right. So, the constructs of explicit and implicit distinction permeates a lot of layers in second language teaching and learning. So, for example, you can see that it is instructional side, explicit and implicit instructions, and followed by explicit and implicit learning and knowledge, the product of learning and teaching. And this has been one of the central issues in SLA research for a long time because it has significant implications for both theoretical and pedagogical reasons. And I'd like to turn your attention to especially for the product of explicit and implicit learning because this is like a main kind of like a domain that I've been developing the new theories of explicit and implicit distinction. And so when we zoom in this knowledge side, so if you can see that explicit learning leads to explicit knowledge because when you engage in conscious learning and a lot of classroom practice involves conscious memorization and learning of like roles, right? And when you first learn explicit knowledge that is accessible to consciousness, and I'm developing some new like thinking that even if you are aware and conscious of explicit type of knowledge, but you can still speed up the use of this conscious knowledge. And this I labeled as automata explicit knowledge, and some researchers like Michel Paradis, like neurolinguists, call this like speeded up declarative knowledge. And on the other side, you can see that implicit learning mechanisms that lead to implicit knowledge in the end, hopefully for many adult second language learners. But as you can see that even if you engage in implicit learning in the beginning, it starts like gradually from like a really little amount of implicit knowledge because it takes a lot of time and practice to develop full-fledged implicit knowledge. So the question is, to what the extent to which adult second language learners can actually attain implicit knowledge. And maybe like if you look at only classroom learners, maybe like they may develop some like a portion of implicit knowledge to some extent in some domain of the language acquisition, but maybe full-fledged implicit knowledge is a really difficult thing to achieve for many adult second language learners. But what I'd like to draw your attention to is this like kind of a developmental sequence here, like, and I call this like speed up or automatization. And if you look at two types of knowledge, explicit and implicit knowledge, and you can see that on this side, both types of knowledge you can be used quickly, so they're kind of speeded up, and at the same time they can be used like more efficiently or like more effortlessly probably. But the distinction here is like I'm trying to make over the past few years is that based on the awareness criterion, that is the sole criterion that can distinguish between explicit and implicit knowledge. So at the practical level, they can be used quickly and efficiently and without effort, right? So is it really necessary distinction? That's kind of thing that I'd like to ask you in the end. Like today, like I'd like to open the floor for discussion about like what kind of practical implication we can get from this theoretical distinction. Like a few second language researchers are claiming the distinction, including myself and Robert Kaiser here. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about this distinction. And I put here like interface. This has been one of the central issues since the Krashen said that learning and acquisitions are completely different things, and learning is marginal for the development of implicit knowledge, like acquisition, acquire knowledge. So like what we are interested in is to what extent explicit knowledge, or perhaps automata explicit knowledge, influence the acquisition of implicit knowledge. Okay, so I'd like to draw this question once again that who should care about the distinction between explicit and implicit knowledge. So I believe that in my understanding, L2 researchers need to specify at least what types of linguistic knowledge they are measuring. And in instructed SLA research, in particular, the role of explicit instructions has been examined intensively, and there are a lot of meta-analysis starting from Norris and Antico 2000, and followed by a lot of replications and extension of this topic. And the key question is explicit instruction necessary or like facilitated for the acquisition of implicit knowledge or automatized explicit knowledge? And more like the bigger question is the default mode of L2 class learning explicit or implicit? So implicit learning can take place in classroom, and if it does, then we should develop measurements for implicit knowledge, right? So the crucial issue we have before testing this fundamental question in classroom is we need valid measurements for explicit and implicit knowledge. So, and there are a lot of studies since 2005 when Rob Ellis proposed some test boundaries for explicit and implicit knowledge tests. And one of the measurements has been kind of quite popular for measuring implicit knowledge. That is elicited imitation task, which is the focus of this presentation. So in this task, this is an example in Japanese, but what you have to see here is that this task consists of two components. One is listening part, where they are asked to listen to the sentence for meaning. So they have to answer the comprehension question after they listen to the sentence. And sometimes they hear grammatical sentence and ungrammatical sentence are inserted sometimes. Then after comprehending the question, they are asked to repeat back the sentence in correct sentence. And this is the speaking part, so it consists of listening and speaking task. And a lot of researchers claim that it is a good measurement for implicit knowledge, but some researchers, including myself and not many others, automate explicit knowledge. So using this EI task as a sample, promising test of implicit knowledge, I'd like to pursue how we can validate this measurement as explicit or implicit knowledge. And one common approach in the previous study was factor analytic approach. So you administer bunches of tests to the same group of participants. Then you examine what kind of tests clustered together, and if one group of tests, for example, like time pressure test clustered together, as opposed to the untimed test, then you label as an implicit kind of test and explicit type of test. But if you administer different types of tests, this factor analytic approach falls into the pitfall, because labeling, the label construct, requires strong theoretical rationales. Otherwise, interpretation of these two extractive factors can be arbitrary. So, this approach has been done since 2005 after the seminal work by Rob Ellis, and now I'm trying to create a new type of validation approach, which is neurophysiological approach. So we have seen increasing number of research and advancement in applying psycholinguistic concurrent measurements to examine L2 processing, and for example, eye tracking and EEG and MRI. And I'd like to focus on MRI because it gives us excellent spatial resolution in terms of which part of the brain is activated while they are engaging in specific language processing. And I feel that MRI can distinguish areas of activation, even a few milliseconds apart, and locate brain regions responsible for specific use of language. And we all know that explicit and implicit knowledge and learning are theoretically founded in neurolinguistic theories. For example, like Michael Ullmann's declarative and procedural model, and Michel Parady's model as well. And so explicit knowledge or declarative memory is considered to be stored in the hippocampus and other medial temporal lobe structures. On the other hand, implicit knowledge or procedural memory is stored in very different parts of the brain, and usually basal ganglia and the left inferior frontal regions. So based on these theories, I wanted to test to what extent this elicited imitation task that has been used in a lot of research And to what extent the EI task can be mapped onto different types of the brain structures while they are performing the task. So, because I don't have any experience in neurolinguistic techniques, so I started to look for like collaboration, and I was really fortunate to collaborate with Dr. Hyenjeong Jeong, and also Motoaki Sugiura, Professor Motoaki Sugiura, and Tohoku University PhD students. So this has been like a 2-year project so far, and we are looking at the validity of different types of language tests for the explicit and implicit measurements. Okay, so the goal of this project is applying the fMRI technique to explicit and implicit knowledge test variety in the field, and we examine the neural correlates explicit and implicit knowledge. And I'd like to report the preliminary results on the part of the large-scale study on the validity of its imitation task, because I also administered water monitoring task which utilize the reaction time measurements, but for the sake of time, I'd like to focus on the illicit imitation task here. So this is a design of the study, and as you can see, the target language task, one is the illicit imitation task, and the other one is water monitoring task. Then I'd like to focus on illicit imitation task for today's talk, but if you look at the right side, and you have explicit knowledge test, meta-linguistic knowledge test, and auditory GJT are like good measurements of conscious knowledge. And explicit learning aptitude is measured by LAMA-F, one of the sub-tests of LAMA test, and implicit learning aptitude was measured by serial reaction time task. So for the sake of time, I cannot explain in detail about these individual difference measures, but please assume that they are kind of good measurements and they're kind of slightly more established measurements compared to language tasks. So the focus is whether illicit imitation task is related to these individual difference measurements. Okay, so this is the prediction, and prediction is pretty simple because I predict that illicit imitation task is a measure of speeded up or automata explicit knowledge. So I predict that it's related to meta-linguistic knowledge test and auditory GJT. They are tapping into the same type of linguistic knowledge, or same type of grammatical knowledge. And explicit learning aptitude will be correlated with illicit imitation task if illicit imitation task measures or tap into explicit types of knowledge. And on the other hand, implicit learning aptitude will not be correlated with illicit imitation task. Okay? And here's the prediction for the neural measurement. And as I said that explicit knowledge and implicit knowledge are stored in different parts of the brain. And so illicit imitation task should primarily draw on declarative memory, which is medial temporal lobe, including hippocampus, and does not correlate with procedural memory, inferior frontal regions, including basal ganglia. So we had really strong prediction, specific predictions, which part of the brain responsible for explicit and implicit memory should be related to illicit imitation task of brain activation. Okay, so here are the participants of the study. I recruited Japanese native speakers as a control, and today I'd like to focus on L2 data. Here I recruited Chinese native speakers living in Japan, and they're studying Japanese as a second language in naturalistic immersion context. I recruited 25 of Chinese speakers, and their proficiency is advanced based on the standardized Japanese language proficiency test. They passed the highest level, N1, so this is kind of minimum requirement for the entrance to the university. It's like IELTS, 0.7 or 7.0 or something like that. Right? And the age of arrival was I was focusing on adult learners, so they came to Japan after the age of 18, and their length of residence is 1 year longer because I wanted to measure the implicit knowledge if they have, right? So they need to at least have some exposure to naturalistic settings. So I could kind of set that by about higher, and recruiting the mean length of residence in Japan was 30 months average. And academic background was a bachelor degrees or higher. And a lot of them have studied Japanese in Chinese university before coming to Japan. So they probably had a lot of explicit instructions in Chinese universities, and they had developed explicit knowledge but not automatized yet. But if they came to Japan and practiced using Japanese in natural settings, and they probably have both automatized explicit knowledge and implicit knowledge if they have. So this is a design of a task, LS imitation task. They listen to they listen to the sentence, they answer the comprehension question, they say like 3 to 1 in Japanese so that prevents them from like rote memorization of the sentence. Then they repeat the sentence back. And I focus on 4 basic Japanese case markers. All of them are taught in elementary Japanese classes, so they should have explicit knowledge and metalinguistic knowledge. And they may develop, use it for acquiring explicit, speeded up explicit knowledge and implicit knowledge. Okay, and I also administered retrospective questionnaire as supplementary data, and to examine their attention allocation and awareness after, while they're performing the task. So I administered this questionnaire right after they performed the EI task. And for attention allocation, the question was when you were listening to, there are 2 questions for this, when they were listening to the sentence, which aspect did you pay attention to, form or errors or meaning, and also I asked the same question when they are repeating. And for the awareness, so did you notice any grammatical errors? Half of the sentences, less than half of the sentences were ungrammatical, so I asked them to what extent they noticed grammatical errors. Okay, so far so good? Okay. All right, so let's take a look at the results. So let's take a look at the results in behavioral data. And retrospective questionnaire, so attention allocation is that they were focusing on meaning, all of them. They were able to fill in, to choose the answers as many options as they want. So 100% they said meaning, and 43% of them focus on form at the same time, and also 65% of them focus on errors. So they're quite aware, and they're paying attention to linguistic correctness when they are listening, even when they are listening to the sentence. And for the repeating, they're slightly higher, right? So a lot of them, more than half of them, were paying attention to linguistic form when they are listening and repeating the sentence. And for the awareness measurements, only to report in the questionnaire, so there will be 23 here, but 10% of the participants were unaware completely throughout the EI task, but more than 90% of them were aware of the role. And here, real aware is this person in this category, the participants in this category were able to at least tell one grammatical structure that were actually incorrect. So some of them said that I noticed a grammatical error, but reported a different grammatical structure that were actually not tested, because there are a lot of the grammatical structures embedded in stimuli, so they were not able to accurately report the specific grammatical structure that were wrong in the sentence, right? So, but it's really difficult because it's been 40 minutes of the experiment, and they have to report, think back and what kind of errors they heard. So, but overall, they were quite kind of keen on detecting and also using grammatical structures accurately. Okay. So, the correlations in the behavioral data is that LS imitation task was correlated, significantly correlated with metalinguistic knowledge test scores, 0.46. It's good, right? As predicted. And more strongly correlated with auditory GJT, which is also good. And there was no significant correlation between either aptitude test. And there was, of course, a significant relationship between metalinguistic knowledge test and auditory GJT. So I wanted to factor out the covering these 2 variables. So I ran multiple regression. Then the significant predictor was only auditory GJT, but still, which is in the domain of explicit knowledge test, and there's the connection, strong connection between auditory GJT and LS imitation task. Okay. And let me explain a little bit about the brain analysis. That I'm not an expert in brain analysis, so if you have questions, technical questions, please ask Hyenjeong Jeong or Motoaki in the room. So, but as far as I understand, there are 2 types of analysis they run. One is overall analysis by comparing the brain activation regions between grammatical and ungrammatical sentences. And the second analysis is more interesting, individual difference analysis, because I had this dependent variable. Oh, sorry, dependent variable. Is this even on?
It is.
It is okay. All right. Okay. So I cannot hear right along. Okay. So and we have a lot of like predicting variables. Independent variables was auditory GJT, meta-linguistic knowledge test, and SRT is like an implicit aptitude, and Llama is like explicit aptitude. And these two analyses were conducted for the listening part and speaking part separately, because we assume that the speaking part and the listening part requires quite different language processing. Okay, so overall analysis for the listening part is found that left inferior frontal gyrus, LIFG, was more activated when they were listening to ungrammatical sentences than to grammatical sentences. And this LIFG is responsible for grammatical error processing, so which is kind of quite consistent because they were able to pick up the grammatical errors when they are listening to the sentence, but they are focusing on meaning. And for the speaking, overall analysis showed no significant differences between ungrammatical and grammatical sentences during speaking at all. And maybe like test takers were presumably trying to say correct sentences equally for both types of sentences, grammatical or ungrammatical sentences, but they were trying to say the sentence correctly regardless of the stimulus being grammatical or ungrammatical. And for the individual difference analysis, and while they are listening, only meta-linguistic knowledge test score was significant predictor of posterior cingulate cortex and bilateral inferior parietal lobules. That gets long, yeah. These two parts, right? But what I know is that these two brain parts are responsible for the regulation of the attention. So when they're listening, maybe they kind of notice grammatical errors, and their original attention is usually directed to meaning. But when they pick up ungrammatical errors, they need to shift their attention to errors, right? So that may be why they kind of shifted their attention using these brain regions. And actually, it's interesting because Morgan showed she kind of conducted a MRI study on the learning of grammar using artificial grammar learning, and she found the exact very similar regions for this regulation of attention when participants learned grammar rules at the a later stage. So this kind of regulation of attention plays an important role when they are trying to use grammar at the advanced levels. And here is the most important slides in this talk. And for the individual difference analysis, whilst speaking, then I found a significant relationship between GJT and meta-linguistic knowledge scores with hippocampus as predicted, because it's responsible for declarative memory, but not with basal ganglia. And test takers might have used speeded up declarative or explicit knowledge for production. And this is kind of plausible because when they produce a language, they can monitor their utterances using the explicit knowledge. So this is quite consistent with what I was thinking back in 2015, where I first proposed that LSLARF imitation can be a measurement of automatized explicit knowledge. Okay, so this is a summary of the results. And for the retrospective questionnaire, 70% of participants attended to grammatical errors during the production, and 19% of the participants were aware of errors at least. And behavioral correlation, the EI performance was related to meta-linguistic knowledge and GJT performance, but not with explicit or implicit aptitude. And for the MRI results, the activation of hippocampus, which is responsible for declarative memory, during the EI production was associated with GJT and meta-linguistic knowledge test. So, discussion. EI should be considered as a method for assessing automatic explicit knowledge, given this finding supporting that declarative memory was involved especially for production. And when performing the EI task, most L2 speakers were probably retrieving declarative explicit knowledge quickly, because I imposed time pressure, like in 8 seconds or so, when they are producing the sentence. Perhaps more pre-production tests, for example, like an oral picture narration task, may draw on implicit knowledge to a larger degree than EI task, but it will be too difficult to ensure the construct quality because it's nearly impossible to tell apart automata explicit knowledge and implicit knowledge behavior because they are used quickly. So it's really difficult to tell apart if this person is using the language without awareness or like this person is using the language with awareness but quickly. Right? So it's really difficult to tell apart. And so for the pre-production task, any production test may be difficult to distinguish these really theoretical distinction between explicit and implicit knowledge. And furthermore, even the advanced adult learners tend to rely on explicit declarative system and when engaging in comprehension production rather than implicit and procedural system. And the question is there any implicit learning among these naturalistic learners? And based on the results on another language test, while the monitoring task, they actually did show activation in basal ganglia, specifically left-coded, which is responsible for procedural memory. So they do have implicit knowledge when they are exposed to naturalistic input in Japan for like 30 months, on average. So they do have implicit knowledge, but when they are relying on producing the language for correct sentences, they tend to rely more, fall back onto automatized explicit knowledge systems. So they do have both, but depending on the task and the situation, they may rely on one type of knowledge over the other, and this kind of mixed picture here. But what about classroom learners? So I was testing naturalistic learners living in Japan for at least 1 year, and on average they live in 2 or 3 years, but they still rely on automated or speeded up declarative system. So what about classroom learners? I'm not saying a lot, but I'm gonna let the silence think about this kind of issues. Okay, and let me lastly discuss a little bit more broader implications based on this really theoretical, small theoretical lab-based studies. And the primary interest in the field has been the comparison between explicit versus implicit teaching and learning. But can we really investigate full-fledged implicit learning in classroom where limited exposure and limited amounts of time allocated for extensive practice? So it may be simpler or testable and potentially more useful for learners, for teachers to examine declarative procedural automatization because focusing on explicit types of knowledge, because in order to acquire implicit knowledge, it takes a lot of time and practice outside the classroom. Yet, little research has been done on this declarative procedural automatization, a loop in the field. So I'd like to propose some kind of questions and also kind of open a wish list for future research in SLA, if I may. And first of all, a more systematic and extensive research is needed to explore the optimal conditions and effective different teaching techniques for automatization of explicit knowledge for pronunciation, lexics, grammar, and grammatics, ideally in classroom settings and from longitudinal perspectives. And some ideas, hopefully useful classroom teaching in the future is one is when you look at effects of explicit instructions, maybe in addition to comparing the effectiveness of explicit and implicit instructions, you could look at the timing of explicit instruction and also frequency, how much, how often do you give explicit instruction, only once in the beginning of the class or many times during the class, and this kind of frequency issue and also quantity, how long do you teach about grammar rules in classroom, and as well as the type of instruction and content of instructions. And then Xiao and Li, for example, examine the timing of explicit instructions in the prior to the practice or during the practice or after the practice. This kind of issue has not been received central interest in the SLA field, but this is quite relevant for classroom teaching. And the second potential area for research is examining the quantity and quality of practice. For example, like what I'm interested in over the past few years is how we can distribute the practice opportunities. Is it like a masked or like spaced, and also like interleaved or blocked, like which has been explored in cognitive psychology research. But what about the second language practice? Can we? Is it better to give like a mass intensive practice for proceduralization of automatization of grammatical knowledge, or is it better to distribute or like interleave for more for acquiring or like the automatized explicit knowledge? And the last thing is tied to the theme of this symposium, the individual differences, and some researchers like Morgan Schultz proposed that there could be an aptitude components that are specifically dedicated for declarative and procedural learning, and this is like these three kind of domains for can be used for directions from the perspective of the declarative and explicit learning perspectives. Okay, so that's all. Thank you very much.